Story 1. The Hitchhiker Who Remembered Tomorrow. Benjamin Cole had been driving trucks for 29 years, and he'd made it an ironclad rule never to pick up hitchhikers. It was company policy, insurance liability, and just common sense in an era when you never knew who might climb into your cab. But on a fog-shrouded October night in 2023, somewhere along Highway 101 in Northern California, Benjamin broke that rule for a young woman standing in the rain and discovered that some passengers know things they shouldn't because they've already lived the journey you're about to take. Benjamin was hauling lumber from Eureka to San Francisco, a nighttime run along the coastal highway. The fog was thick enough to cut with a knife, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet despite his high beams. Rain hammered the windshield in sheets, and Benjamin had slowed to 40 miles per hour, half his normal speed. Around 2 in the morning, his headlights caught a figure on the shoulder, a young woman, maybe 25, wearing a light jacket that was soaked through. She had her thumb out, the universal gesture of hitchhiking. Benjamin's instinct was to drive past, but something made him brake. Maybe it was the weather. The knowledge that anyone stranded in this fog and rain could die from exposure. Maybe it was the desperate look on her face as she turned toward his truck. Benjamin pulled onto the shoulder and rolled down his passenger window. "You okay? Need help?" "Please," the woman said, rain streaming down her face. "My car broke down 3 miles back. My phone's dead. I've been walking for over an hour. I just need a ride to the next town." Benjamin unlocked the passenger door. "Get in." The woman climbed into the cab, bringing the smell of rain and something else, something faintly medicinal like hospital disinfectant. She was shivering, her dark hair plastered to her skull. "I'm Benjamin. Where are you trying to get to?" "Anywhere with people, a gas station, a town, anywhere I can call for help." She paused, then added, "Thank you for stopping. Most drivers wouldn't have." "Most drivers are smarter than me," Benjamin said, pulling back onto the highway. "What's your name?" "Sarah." She stared straight ahead through the windshield, not looking at Benjamin. Sarah Mitchell. They drove in silence for several minutes. Benjamin kept glancing at Sarah, trying to figure out what was bothering him about her. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, not fidgeting or checking pockets for her dead phone, not doing any of the small, restless movements people usually made. "So what happened to your car?" Benjamin asked. "Engine died, all the lights came on, and it just stopped." Sarah finally turned to look at him, and Benjamin saw that her eyes were wrong. Too dark, pupils dilated too wide, or maybe there were no pupils at all. It was strange, like something drained all the power at once. Could be the alternator, or the battery died. "It wasn't mechanical," Sarah said quietly. "It was the fog. There's something in the fog tonight that kills engines. You're going to find out in about 6 miles. Benjamin's hands tightened on the wheel. "What do you mean?" "Your truck is going to die at mile marker 47. The engine will cut out completely, just like my car. All the electrical systems will fail. You'll coast to a stop, and then we'll both be stranded in the fog." "That's not funny." "I'm not joking. I'm warning you because I've already lived through this. I'm trying to help you prepare." Benjamin felt ice water in his veins. "What are you talking about? You've already lived through this?" Sarah turned back to stare at the road ahead. "I picked you up 3 hours from now. Or I will pick you up depending on how you think about time. After your truck dies and you start walking, you find me on the side of the road. I'm the one hitchhiking, and you're the one stranded. We have this same conversation but reversed. You tell me your truck died at mile marker 47, and I try to warn my past self, the me that's sitting here right now, but past me doesn't listen. So I'm trapped in a loop, living the same hours over and over." Benjamin stared at her. This was insane. Sarah was clearly disturbed, possibly dangerous. He should pull over and tell her to get out. But something in her voice carried absolute conviction, and Benjamin had learned to trust his instincts over 3 decades of driving. "If you've already lived this," Benjamin said carefully, "then you know what happens next. Tell me how to avoid it." "I don't know if you can avoid it. I've tried different things each loop. Sometimes I don't stop for you. Sometimes I don't stop for my past self. But it doesn't matter. The loop always happens. The truck dies at marker 47, we both end up walking in the fog, and then we're back at the beginning, me standing on the shoulder where you picked me up. How long have you been in this loop?" "I don't know. Time doesn't work normally here. Sometimes it feels like hours, sometimes like years. I've lived through tonight hundreds of times, maybe thousands." Benjamin checked his GPS. Mile marker 43 was coming up. 4 miles until marker 47 if Sarah's prediction was accurate. Benjamin pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to speed past whatever awaited them. But as they approached mile marker 47, Benjamin's truck began to falter. The dashboard lights flickered. The engine coughed, missing cylinders randomly. Benjamin watched in horror as all his truck's systems failed simultaneously. Engine, electrical, hydraulics, everything dying at once. The truck coasted to a stop exactly at mile marker 47, just as Sarah had predicted. Benjamin sat in the sudden silence, his mind racing. Sarah had been right. She'd known exactly where and how his truck would fail, which meant the rest of her story might be true too. The loop, the repeated journey, the inability to escape. "What happens now?" Benjamin asked. "Now we walk. We try to find help, but there's no help in the fog. Eventually we get separated. You keep walking forward, I walk backward, and then the loop resets. You find me standing on the shoulder where you originally picked me up, and we start again. There has to be a way to break it. Loops have rules, patterns. If we can figure out what maintains the loop, maybe we can disrupt it." Sarah shook her head. "I've tried everything. Nothing works. We're trapped in the same sequence of events, repeating forever." Benjamin refused to accept it. He grabbed his CB radio, dead. His phone, no signal, and the battery was draining rapidly despite being fully charged moments ago. His truck's battery was completely drained, unable to even turn over the starter. Sarah was already climbing out of the cab. "We should start walking. Standing here doesn't help." Benjamin followed her into the fog. The rain had stopped, but the fog was thicker than before, reducing visibility to 10 feet. The highway was empty in both directions, no traffic, no lights, no indication that anyone else existed in the world. They walked side by side along the shoulder. Benjamin tried to mark their progress, looking for landmarks, but the fog made everything identical. Trees appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Mile markers couldn't be read until they were directly beside them. "Tell me about the other loops," Benjamin said. "What have you tried?" "Everything. I've walked in different directions. I've stayed with the truck. I've tried to hotwire it. I've broken windows, set fires, screamed for help. Nothing changes the outcome. We always reset, always start over with you picking me up. What if we don't separate? You said we get separated and then the loop resets. What if we stay together?" "We've tried that. It doesn't matter. The fog takes us anyway. One moment we're walking side by side, the next moment I'm alone, and then I'm back at the beginning." They walked for what felt like hours. Benjamin's watch had stopped at 2:47 a.m., the exact moment his truck had died. Time was frozen here or moving in ways that didn't correspond to clock time. Then Benjamin saw lights ahead, a rest area, or what looked like one. Buildings emerged from the fog, a parking lot, picnic tables. But something was wrong about it. The structures looked faded, like photographs left too long in sunlight. The parking lot was empty except for one vehicle, a car that Benjamin recognized with a chill of horror. It was Sarah's car, a blue sedan, hood up, clearly broken down. the same car she'd claimed died 3 miles back. "This is where it started," Sarah said quietly. "My car died here. I walked from here back to where you picked me up. But that doesn't make sense geographically. I should have walked away from your position, not toward it. The geography is wrong. The loop twists space as well as time." Benjamin approached the car and looked inside. Empty. No keys, no personal items, nothing to indicate who owned it or how long it had been here. But the interior was pristine, as if the car had been abandoned moments ago rather than hours. "What if we take the car?" Benjamin suggested. "Try to drive out of the loop? No keys, and the engine is dead, remember? Same thing that killed your truck." Benjamin checked the hood. The engine looked normal, no obvious damage, no disconnected wires. But when he tried to identify the problem, Benjamin realized he couldn't understand what he was looking at. The engine's components were arranged wrong, connected in ways that didn't match any vehicle he'd worked on. It was as if the car's mechanical systems had been scrambled, reorganized into a configuration that looked right but wasn't. "The loop is changing things," Benjamin said, "rearranging reality to keep us trapped." "I know. I've noticed it too. Each time through, details change. Sometimes the car is a different color. Sometimes there are more buildings in the rest area. The loop isn't stable. It's evolving or degrading, I can't tell which." Benjamin walked away from the rest area, Sarah following. They continued down the highway, the fog swallowing everything behind them. Benjamin tried to mark their path, breaking branches on trees, arranging rocks in patterns, but when he looked back, the markers were gone, erased by the fog or rearranged into different configurations. Then Benjamin saw something that made him stop, a figure ahead walking toward them. As they drew closer, Benjamin recognized himself. It was Benjamin wearing the same clothes, looking exhausted and desperate. "Don't trust her," the other Benjamin said, pointing at Sarah. "She's not real. She's part of the loop. She keeps you trapped here." Sarah grabbed Benjamin's arm. "Don't listen to him. He's not you. He's what the loop creates to confuse us." The other Benjamin shook his head. "I'm you from later in the loop. I've walked further than you have. I've seen what happens if you stay with her. She absorbs you. She needs you to maintain the loop. Without you, she disappears." Benjamin looked between Sarah and his doppelganger, trying to determine who was lying. But maybe they were both telling the truth from their own perspectives. Maybe the loop created multiple versions of both of them, all trapped in the same repeating sequence but experiencing it differently. "What do I do?" Benjamin asked. "Walk away from her," the other Benjamin said. "Break the connection. As long as you're together, the loop persists. Separate, and it might collapse." "No," Sarah said. "If we separate, we just reset. I've told you this. We have to stay together and find a way to escape together." Benjamin made a choice. He started running away from both Sarah and his doppelganger, into the fog in a direction perpendicular to the highway. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, ran until he couldn't run anymore. When Benjamin stopped and looked around, he was standing on the shoulder of Highway 101 at mile marker 44. His truck was visible ahead, parked where he'd stopped to pick up the hitchhiker, and standing beside the truck was Sarah, looking exactly as she had when Benjamin first saw her. Soaked with rain, thumb out, desperate. The loop had reset. Benjamin had returned to the beginning. Benjamin sat on the wet pavement, his head in his hands. Sarah had been telling the truth. They were trapped in a repeating sequence, unable to escape, cycling through the same events over and over. Sarah walked over and sat beside him. "You tried to run. I've tried that too. It doesn't work. How do we get out? I don't know. Maybe we don't. Maybe we're here forever, living the same hours, trying the same solutions, failing the same ways." Benjamin looked at his truck. The engine was running normally, all systems functional. The loop would progress to mile marker 47, the truck would die, they'd walk into the fog, encounter the rest area and the doppelganger, and then reset. Again and again, unless Benjamin changed something fundamental. What if he didn't drive? What if he just sat here and refused to participate in the loop? Benjamin stood up. "I'm not getting back in the truck, I'm staying right here." "That won't work. The loop forces progression. If you don't drive, something else happens to move us forward. A police officer appears and makes you move. Or the fog closes in. Or the highway shifts beneath us. The loop has mechanisms to enforce its sequence." As if in response to Sarah's words, the fog began to thicken, pressing in from all sides. The temperature dropped rapidly. Benjamin felt the fog pushing him toward his truck, physically hurting him like a sheepdog guiding livestock. "You see," Sarah said, "we have to participate. The loop doesn't allow refusal." Benjamin climbed back into his truck, Sarah getting in beside him. They drove to mile marker 47. The truck died on schedule. They walked into the fog. They reached the rest area with Sarah's car. They encountered Benjamin's doppelganger. They separated, reset, and began again. This happened hundreds of times. Benjamin lost count of the iterations. Each loop was identical except for small variations. Different weather, different words exchanged, different attempts to escape. But the outcome never changed. They were trapped in a sequence that repeated endlessly, imprisoned in a section of Highway 101 that existed outside normal time. Benjamin eventually stopped trying to escape. The loops became routine, almost comfortable in their predictability. He and Sarah developed a strange rapport, companions in an eternal journey through the same hours, the same fog, the same futile attempts to break free. And somewhere in the endless repetitions, Benjamin realized he'd forgotten what came before the loop. Had there been a life before picking up Sarah? Had he been driving to San Francisco for a reason? The memories faded like photographs in sunlight, bleached away by the relentless repetition of the loop. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe they were here forever, two ghosts cycling through the same sequence, unable to die because they were already dead, unable to escape because this was all that remained of their existence. A loop on Highway 101 where a truck died at mile marker 47 and two people walked into fog that erased everything except the pattern itself. The hitchhiker who remembered tomorrow taught Benjamin that time isn't always linear, that some journeys loop back on themselves, and that once you're caught in a repeating sequence, the only way forward is through, again and again and again. Living the same hours forever, remembering tomorrow because tomorrow is always the same as today. Trapped with a passenger who knows everything that will happen because she's already lived it countless times, warning you about events you can't avoid. Watching you try solutions that won't work, waiting patiently for the reset that always comes the moment when you're back at the beginning. Stopping for a hitchhiker in the rain, dooming yourself to another iteration of a journey that never ends, forever driving toward mile marker 47 where your truck will die and the fog will swallow you and tomorrow will become yesterday, will become today. In an endless present where the only constant is the loop itself and the companion who remembers every version of a journey you're experiencing for what feels like the first time but is actually the thousandth or millionth, both of you trapped together in a sequence that repeats until you can't remember who you were before you entered it. Can only remember the loop itself, the pattern, the eternal return to the moment when everything begins again. Story 2. The Scale That Weighed Regrets. Donald Harper had been driving trucks for 26 years when he pulled onto the weigh station scale that measured something other than cargo weight. As a veteran driver with a spotless record, Donald had passed through thousands of weigh stations without incident. He knew the routine: pull onto the scale, wait for the green light, continue driving. Simple, bureaucratic, unremarkable. But in July of 2023, somewhere in West Virginia on Interstate 77, Donald encountered a weigh station that measured burdens that couldn't be quantified in pounds or tons. Donald was hauling furniture from Charlotte to Cleveland, a straightforward 2-day run through the Appalachian Mountains. He'd been driving since dawn, making good time on empty highways when he saw the weigh station sign commanding all trucks to enter. Donald signaled and took the exit, rolling into the facility with practiced ease. The weigh station looked standard, scale embedded in the pavement, small office building, a few parking spots for detailed inspections. Only one other truck was ahead of Donald, and it cleared the scale quickly, the driver continuing without incident. Donald pulled onto the scale and waited for the indicator light. But instead of the expected green light showing legal weight, the display showed something that made Donald's breath catch. Emotional cargo. 847 pounds. Excessive. Proceed to inspection area. Donald stared at the display, trying to make sense of it. Emotional cargo? That wasn't a term used in trucking regulations. His manifest listed furniture, tables, chairs, dressers, with a total weight of 18,000 pounds, well within legal limits. What did emotional cargo mean? A uniformed inspector emerged from the office building and approached Donald's cab. The man looked normal enough, standard dot uniform, clipboard, official badge. But when he spoke, his voice carried an odd resonance, as if multiple people were speaking simultaneously. Mr. Harper, your emotional cargo is overweight. You'll need to come inside for assessment and possible offloading. I don't understand, Donald said. My cargo is furniture. My manifest is clean. I'm not overweight. We're not measuring furniture, Mr. Harper. We're measuring the regrets you're carrying, the guilt, the shame, the decisions you wish you could take back. That weight has accumulated to 847 pounds. That's far above the legal limit of 200 pounds for commercial drivers. You're a safety hazard. Donald felt reality tilting. This was absurd, impossible, some kind of prank or hallucination. Regrets don't have weight. Emotions aren't physical cargo. They have weight here, Mr. Harper. This weigh station measures what you're really carrying. And you're carrying too much. You need to offload before you can continue. The inspector's tone left no room for argument. Donald shut off his engine and followed the man into the office building, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. Weigh stations didn't measure emotions. But the display had shown a specific number, 847 pounds, as if his regrets had been precisely calculated. Inside, the office was larger than its exterior suggested, corridors extending in impossible directions. The inspector led Donald to a room that looked like a doctor's examination room crossed with a confessional booth. A chair sat in the center, surrounded by equipment Donald didn't recognize. Sit, the inspector commanded. We'll identify the heaviest regrets first and work on offloading them. Donald sat, his hands trembling. This was wrong, deeply wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to refuse or leave. Some compulsion kept him compliant, forcing him to participate in this impossible process. The inspector activated the equipment. Screens lit up, displaying information in languages Donald didn't know, symbols he couldn't read. But then images began to appear. Memories from Donald's life, moments he'd tried to forget, decisions he wished he could change. Your heaviest regret weighs 214 pounds, the inspector said, pointing to a screen showing a memory from 15 years ago. A woman named Patricia. You were married, she was pregnant. You had a choice. Stay home for the birth or take a high-paying cross-country haul that would keep you away for a week. You chose the haul. You missed your daughter's birth. Patricia never forgave you. The marriage ended 2 years later. You carry that choice every day, don't you, Mr. Harper? The weight of choosing money over family. Donald felt tears streaming down his face. He hadn't thought about that decision in years, had buried it under layers of rationalization and self-justification. But the weight had always been there, pressing down on him, a burden he carried without acknowledging. "To offload this regret, you must acknowledge it," the inspector said. "Speak it aloud. Accept responsibility without excuses." "I chose wrong," Donald whispered. "I valued money over my family. I wasn't there when my daughter was born. It was selfish. It was wrong." The screen flickered and dimmed. Donald felt something lift from his shoulders, a physical sensation of weight being removed. The inspector checked his instruments. "That regret now weighs 87 pounds. Reduced but not eliminated. You can't completely offload something that fundamental, but you've lightened it considerably. Let's move to the next one." More screens activated, showing more memories. Donald's second divorce caused by his absence and emotional unavailability. The time he'd driven past a stranded motorist because he was behind schedule, and later heard that the motorist had died from exposure. The friend he'd abandoned when that friend needed help because Donald had been focused on his career. The promises he'd broken, the relationships he'd destroyed, the moments when he'd chosen convenience over compassion. Each memory was quantified, given a precise weight in pounds. Each regret had accumulated over years, pressing down on Donald's psyche, creating a burden that affected his driving, his health, his ability to connect with others. The inspector worked through Donald's regrets methodically, forcing him to acknowledge each one, to speak the truth without rationalization or excuse. Some regrets were lightened through confession. Others remained heavy, too fundamental to Donald's identity to be fully offloaded. After what felt like hours, the inspector checked his final calculations. "You're down to 312 pounds of emotional cargo, still above the legal limit, but low enough that we can grant you a temporary waiver. You're cleared to continue driving, but you'll need to report to another assessment station within 6 months. If your emotional cargo increases beyond 400 pounds, your commercial driver's license will be suspended until you complete mandatory counseling." Donald stumbled out of the office building in a daze. He climbed back into his truck and checked the scale display. It now read, "Emotional cargo, 312 pounds, caution advised." Donald drove away from the weigh station, his mind reeling. He'd been forced to confront regrets he'd spent years avoiding, had been made to acknowledge burdens he'd carried unconsciously. The experience had been traumatic, humiliating, but also oddly liberating. The weight on his shoulders felt lighter. His breathing came easier. Over the following weeks, Donald tried to research the weigh station to find documentation of emotional cargo assessment procedures. He found nothing. Other drivers he asked had never heard of such a thing. Weigh stations measured truck weight, not emotional burdens. But Donald knew what he'd experienced. He'd been assessed, had his regrets quantified and cataloged, had been forced to offload enough weight to continue driving. And the experience changed him. Donald started making different choices. He called Patricia and apologized for missing their daughter's birth, didn't make excuses or justify his decision, just acknowledged it was wrong. He reached out to the friend he'd abandoned years ago, tried to rebuild that relationship. He stopped more frequently to help stranded motorists, no longer prioritizing schedule over human need. And Donald's emotional cargo decreased. He could feel it, a lightening that came from making better choices, from addressing regrets rather than accumulating new ones. 6 months later, Donald found himself approaching the same section of Interstate 77 where he'd encountered the emotional assessment station. He took the exit, looking for the weigh station, ready for his follow-up assessment. But the weigh station was gone. Just empty land where the facility should have been, no evidence that it had ever existed. Donald drove back and forth along that stretch of highway, searching, but found nothing. The weigh station had disappeared, or perhaps had never existed in normal reality. Maybe it only appeared to drivers who carried excessive emotional cargo, materializing when needed and vanishing once its purpose was served. Donald never found that way station again, but he carried the experience with him, the knowledge that his regrets had weight, that his emotional burdens could be measured and quantified. And Donald worked to keep those burdens light, making choices that minimized regret, addressing mistakes quickly rather than letting them accumulate into crushing weight that would eventually force him back to a weigh station that measured what you carried in your heart, rather than your trailer. The scale that weighed regrets taught Donald that some burdens can't be seen but are heavier than any physical cargo, that the weight of bad decisions accumulates over years until it becomes unsustainable, and that the only way to lighten that load is to acknowledge it, to speak the truth without excuses, to accept responsibility for choices made and harm caused, and to live differently going forward, making decisions that minimize the emotional cargo you'll carry, the regrets you'll accumulate, the burdens that will eventually become so heavy that reality itself stops you at a weigh station that doesn't appear on any map, forces you to sit in a room where your heaviest mistakes are displayed on screens for measurement and assessment, quantified in pounds that measure not mass but the weight of conscience, the density of guilt, the accumulation of all the moments when you chose wrong and knew it but did it anyway. Carrying forward until the burden becomes unbearable and the only relief comes from confession, from acknowledgement, from the painful process of offloading regrets by speaking them aloud and accepting that you can't change the past, but you can lighten its weight by not adding to it, by making better choices from this moment forward, by keeping your emotional cargo below the threshold where weigh stations appear to stop you, to assess you, to force you to confront what you've been carrying all along. Story 3. The load that arrived before it was shipped. Marcus Reynolds had been hauling freight for 18 years when he picked up a load in Memphis that was delivered before he arrived at the destination. As a logistics professional, Marcus understood how supply chains worked. Cargo was shipped from origin to destination in linear time, following predictable schedules and routes. But in August of 2023, Marcus loaded a trailer in Tennessee that would teach him that time doesn't always flow in one direction, and that some deliveries complete themselves before the journey begins. Marcus was at a warehouse in Memphis, backing his truck up to a loading dock to receive a shipment of electronics bound for a distributor in Phoenix. The manifest listed standard items: computers, monitors, networking equipment, with a total weight of 22,000 pounds and a delivery deadline of 3 days. The warehouse workers loaded the cargo efficiently, securing pallets of electronics in Marcus's trailer. Everything seemed normal until Marcus closed the trailer doors and applied the security seal. The seal's serial number was 874563, which Marcus logged as required. Marcus started his drive west, taking Interstate 40 across Arkansas and into Oklahoma. The route was straightforward, the truck handled well, and Marcus made good time. He planned to drive through the night, reach the Texas Panhandle by morning, and deliver to Phoenix by the deadline. Around 2 a.m., somewhere in western Arkansas, Marcus stopped at a truck stop for fuel and a bathroom break. As he was pumping diesel, another driver approached him. An older man, maybe 60, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades on the road. "That's a nice rig," the older driver said. "What are you hauling?" "Electronics. Memphis to Phoenix." The older driver's expression changed, his eyes widening. "What's your trailer seal number?" 874563. Why? The man backed away slowly. "No, that's not possible. I delivered that exact load 3 days ago. Same seal number, same cargo. That seal was cut and logged when I delivered to Phoenix. It can't be on your trailer now." Marcus frowned. "You must be thinking of a different load. This seal is fresh. I just applied it 2 hours ago in Memphis." I'm telling you, I delivered electronics from Memphis to Phoenix 3 days ago, and the seal number was 874563. I remember because I had to testify about it when the cargo showed up before it was shipped. The whole thing was bizarre. The distributor in Phoenix received the delivery before the warehouse in Memphis had even loaded it. Impossible, but it happened. Marcus felt cold creeping up his spine. What are you talking about? Cargo can't be delivered before it's shipped. It can if time runs backwards. That load you're carrying, I already delivered it. You're hauling something that's already arrived at its destination. You're repeating a journey that's already completed. The older driver walked away before Marcus could ask more questions. Marcus stood by his truck trying to process what he'd heard. It was crazy. Cargo didn't arrive before being shipped. Time didn't run backwards. The older driver was confused or lying or suffering from dementia. But Marcus couldn't shake his unease. He called the Memphis warehouse. This is Marcus Reynolds, driver 447. I picked up a load from you about 3 hours ago. Can you confirm the trailer seal number? The warehouse supervisor checked his records. Seal 874563. Electronics shipment to Phoenix. Why? Another driver claims he delivered that exact load 3 days ago. Same seal number. A long pause. That's not possible. This load was just picked up tonight. How could it have been delivered 3 days ago? Marcus didn't have an answer. He finished fueling and continued driving, but his mind kept returning to the older driver's words. What if the cargo had been delivered before being shipped? What would that mean? Some kind of time loop? A glitch in causality? Marcus drove through the night, crossed into Texas by dawn, and continued west through the Panhandle. Everything seemed normal. The truck ran smoothly. The cargo sat secure in the trailer. The GPS tracked his progress normally. But around noon, as Marcus approached Amarillo, he received a call from his dispatcher. Marcus, we've got a problem with your Phoenix load. What kind of problem? The distributor in Phoenix called. They're confused because they already received your delivery 3 days ago. They logged the cargo, checked the seal 874563, and unloaded everything. But according to our shipping records, you just picked up that load last night. They're asking why we're trying to deliver the same shipment twice. Marcus felt reality tilting. I'm currently hauling that cargo. It's in my trailer right now. Then how did it get delivered to Phoenix 3 days ago? Marcus didn't have an answer. He pulled onto the shoulder and sat there trying to think. If the cargo had already been delivered, what was he hauling? He should check the trailer, verify that the cargo was actually there. Marcus climbed out and walked to the back of his trailer. The seal was intact, 874563, unbroken. But when Marcus opened the doors and looked inside, he found the trailer empty. No pallets, no electronics, no cargo at all. The load had vanished, or it had never been there because it was already in Phoenix, delivered 3 days before Marcus picked it up. Marcus sat on the trailer's edge, his head in his hands. This was impossible. Cargo couldn't deliver itself backward through time. Effect couldn't precede cause. But somehow a load that hadn't been shipped yet had already arrived at its destination. Marcus called his dispatcher back. The trailer's empty. The cargo is gone. Gone? What do you mean gone? I mean the trailer contains no cargo. It's completely empty. Whatever I loaded in Memphis has vanished or was never actually loaded or somehow teleported to Phoenix before I could transport it. The dispatcher's voice was strained. Marcus, stay where you are. We're sending someone to inspect your trailer. This doesn't make any sense. Marcus waited on the shoulder of I-40 while his company scrambled to understand what had happened. An inspector arrived 4 hours later, examined Marcus's trailer, and confirmed it was empty. The seal had been intact, the doors locked, but no cargo remained inside. Meanwhile, the distributor in Phoenix confirmed they'd received and unloaded 22,000 pounds of electronics 3 days earlier. They had documentation, signed delivery receipts, unloading records, inventory logs showing the cargo had been received, inspected, and distributed to retail customers. The cargo had been delivered before being shipped. The effect had preceded the cause, and somehow Marcus had been tasked with transporting cargo that was already at its destination. The investigation lasted weeks. Federal transportation authorities got involved, trying to determine if fraud had occurred. Had someone stolen the cargo in Memphis and replaced it with nothing while faking delivery records in Phoenix? But the timelines made no sense. The Phoenix delivery was documented 3 days before the Memphis pickup. Marcus was suspended during the investigation, his commercial driver's license temporarily revoked while authorities tried to figure out what had happened. He spent that time researching temporal anomalies, causality violations, and reports of similar incidents. Marcus found scattered accounts of cargo that arrived before being shipped, of deliveries that completed themselves in reverse chronological order. Always in the trucking industry, always involving specific routes and specific loads. Some physicists called it retrocausality, effects preceding causes, future events influencing past events, time running in both directions simultaneously. Whatever had caused Marcus's cargo to deliver itself backwards through time remained unexplained. The investigation eventually concluded with a non-finding. No fraud detected, no rational explanation available. Case closed as an administrative anomaly. Marcus's license was restored, but he never drove trucks again. He couldn't trust that cargo would stay in his trailer. Couldn't believe that the journeys he made actually transported anything from origin to destination. He'd learned that sometimes the destination receives the cargo before the origin ships it. That drivers become unnecessary middlemen in transactions that complete themselves through mechanisms beyond human understanding. And Marcus wondered how many other loads arrived before being shipped, how many drivers were hauling cargo that was already at its destination, making journeys that were redundant because time had folded back on itself and completed the delivery in reverse, leaving drivers to carry empty trailers across states while believing they were transporting actual goods, unaware that the electronics or furniture or whatever they thought they'd loaded had already materialized at the destination 3 days earlier through some process that violated causality but apparently worked anyway, because recipients signed for deliveries before shipments were picked up, and nobody could explain it. But everyone accepted the paperwork as real, the cargo as delivered, the transaction as complete despite happening in impossible chronological order. With drivers trapped in the middle experiencing linear time while the cargo they carried moved through loops and retrocausal pathways that made origin and destination meaningless terms, just points in a network where time flowed in multiple directions simultaneously. And sometimes your load arrived before you shipped it, and you drove across the country with an empty trailer, completing a journey that was already over before you began it, delivering nothing because everything was already there, lost in temporal paradoxes that transformed trucking from a simple transportation job into something that proved reality was more fluid than anyone wanted to admit. Story 4. The parking lot that multiplied trucks. Leonard Hayes had been driving trucks for 22 years when he parked at a rest area in Nebraska that duplicated his vehicle. As a meticulous driver who maintained detailed records, Leonard knew his truck intimately, every scratch, dent, and identifying feature. But in September of 2023, Leonard stopped at a rest area on Interstate 80 and discovered that his truck was no longer unique, that the facility was creating copies that looked identical but were subtly, terribly wrong. Leonard was hauling agricultural equipment from Iowa to Wyoming, a 2-day run across the Midwest. He'd been driving since early morning and needed a rest break before continuing through the night. Around 7 p.m., he took an exit to a rest area that looked standard. Parking lot with spaces for 24 trucks, restroom building, vending machines, picnic area. Leonard found a parking spot near the back of the lot, shut off his engine, and climbed out to stretch. About a dozen other trucks were parked there, their drivers presumably sleeping or using the facilities. Nothing unusual about the scene. Leonard used the restroom and bought a candy bar from the vending machine. He was walking back to his truck when he noticed something that made him stop. There were 2 trucks identical to his. Same make and model, same color, same company logo. But Leonard's truck was unique, with specific damage on the front bumper from a minor accident 2 years ago. These couldn't both be his truck. Leonard approached the nearest one and checked the front bumper. The damage was there, a small dent and scratch pattern that exactly matched his truck. But this wasn't his truck. Leonard had parked 3 rows back. This truck was in a different row entirely. Confused, Leonard walked to where he'd originally parked. His truck was still there, engine cool, exactly where he'd left it. But the identical truck in the other row was also there, looking exactly the same. Leonard checked the license plates. Both trucks had his plate number, not the same sequence, but his specific plate, as if someone had duplicated his entire vehicle down to the registration details. Leonard tried the doors on the duplicate truck, unlocked. He climbed into the cab and found his personal items, his logbook, his coffee mug, his phone charger, all positioned exactly where he kept them in his original truck. Even the odometer showed the same mileage. This wasn't just a similar truck. This was a perfect copy of his vehicle, duplicated down to the smallest detail. Leonard walked through the parking lot checking other trucks, and he found more. 4 trucks total that were identical to his, all with his plate number, all containing his personal items, all showing the same odometer reading. Leonard's original truck was still where he'd parked it, but now 3 copies existed. Perfect duplicates that looked like they'd been driven the same miles, experienced the same wear, carried the same cargo. Leonard approached one of the other drivers in the lot, a woman who was doing a walk-around inspection of her truck. "Excuse me," Leonard said. "Have you noticed anything strange about this rest area?" The woman looked at him suspiciously. "Like what?" "Like trucks being duplicated. I've got 4 copies of my truck in this lot, all identical." The woman's expression changed from suspicion to recognition. "Oh no, not again. This rest area does that. It makes copies of trucks. Most drivers don't notice because they leave before the copies stabilize, but if you stay long enough, you'll see more copies appearing." "What is this place?" "Some kind of spatial anomaly, maybe quantum duplication or parallel realities bleeding into each other. Nobody knows. But trucks that park here get copied. The copies are perfect. Same damage, same cargo, same everything. You can't tell them apart from the original. What happens to the copies? They just exist. Most drivers don't realize they've been duplicated. They get in what they think is their truck and drive away, but sometimes it's actually a copy. The original might sit here for days before someone notices. The rest area ends up collecting abandoned duplicate trucks that look exactly like vehicles that already left." Leonard stared at his trucks, his original and the 3 copies. How could he tell which was the original? They were all identical. And if the copies were perfect duplicates, did it even matter which one he drove? Leonard checked the cargo in each truck. All 4 trailers contained identical agricultural equipment loaded in exactly the same way, secured with the same straps. Even the dust patterns on the equipment matched perfectly. The duplicates weren't just external copies. They included everything inside, a complete replication of truck, cargo, and contents. Leonard made a decision. He chose one truck at random, couldn't determine if it was his original or a copy, so he just picked one and prepared to leave. But as he started the engine, Leonard noticed something disturbing. Through his mirrors, he could see the other 3 trucks starting their engines simultaneously. The copies were mirroring his actions, doing exactly what he was doing at exactly the same moment. Leonard put his truck in gear. The copies did the same. Leonard backed out of his parking space. The copies backed out of theirs. Leonard drove toward the exit. The copies followed, maintaining the same relative positions in a formation like synchronized swimming. Leonard accelerated onto the interstate, the copies merging alongside him. For several miles, the 4 identical trucks drove in formation, all under Leonard's control somehow, all responding to his steering and throttle inputs as if they were remote-controlled vehicles slaved to his original. Then one by one, the copies diverged. One took a different exit, heading south on a route Leonard hadn't chosen. Another continued west, but faster, pulling ahead and disappearing. The third slowed and fell behind, eventually fading from view. Leonard was alone again, driving a truck that was either his original or a perfect copy with no way to determine which. And somewhere on America's highways, 3 other trucks identical to his were being driven by... what? Autonomous systems? Echoes of his consciousness. Entities that had taken over the duplicates. Leonard completed his delivery to Wyoming but couldn't stop thinking about the rest area. He'd been duplicated and copies of him were driving copies of his truck to destinations he might not have chosen, making deliveries that might not match his manifest, living lives that diverged from his original path. Leonard tried to research the rest area, to find documentation of the duplication phenomenon. He found scattered reports from other drivers describing similar experiences, parking at certain locations and discovering their trucks had been copied, or finding abandoned trucks identical to their own, or encountering other drivers who looked exactly like them driving identical vehicles. The rest areas where duplication occurred weren't marked on maps. They appeared normal, indistinguishable from standard facilities. You only discovered the anomaly after parking and noticing your vehicle had been replicated. Leonard never stopped at that Nebraska rest area again. But the experience haunted him. Was he driving his original truck or was he one of the copies? Had the original Leonard continued on while a duplicate version took over his life? There was no way to know, no test that could distinguish original from copy when the duplication was perfect. And Leonard wondered how many other copies of himself existed, driving identical trucks, living parallel lives that had diverged the moment the duplication occurred. Were they all real? Did they all have equal claim to being the original Leonard Hayes? Or was there only one true Leonard with the others being empty shells, sophisticated simulations that looked and acted like him but lacked genuine consciousness? Leonard couldn't answer these questions. He just drove, completed his routes, and tried not to think about the rest area in Nebraska that had multiplied him, creating versions of Leonard Hayes that were perfect copies externally but might be completely different internally, might be philosophical zombies or quantum duplicates or parallel reality versions of himself that had been pulled into his world through some mechanism he couldn't understand. The parking lot that multiplied trucks taught Leonard that identity isn't as stable as people assume, that the boundary between original and copy becomes meaningless when duplication is perfect, and that some rest areas don't just provide facilities for drivers. They replicate entire trucks and their operators, creating perfect duplicates that diverge and follow their own paths. Splitting one driver into multiple versions that spread across the highway network, all believing they're the original, all carrying the same memories and mannerisms and personal items, all driving identical trucks that were created in parking lots that exist at nodes in reality where quantum probability waves haven't collapsed, where multiple versions of the same truck can exist simultaneously until observation forces them to diverge, sending copies in different directions, creating a network of duplicate drivers who occasionally encounter each other and recognize themselves in the wrong trucks. Driving routes they didn't choose, living lives that feel familiar but slightly off, knowing deep down that they might not be the original but unable to prove it either way. Trapped in existential uncertainty about whether their consciousness is genuine or just a perfect copy of someone else's. Awareness, duplicated in a parking lot where reality multiplies rather than staying singular, where Leonard Hayes became Leonard Hayes's plural, scattered across America's highways like identical marbles rolling in different directions, all of them real, all of them copies, all of them wondering which version is the one who parked at that rest area in Nebraska, and which ones are the duplicates who woke up in identical trucks and drove away into parallel lives that diverged from that moment forward. Story 5. The Bridge That Led to Yesterday. Patricia Crane had been driving trucks for 24 years when she crossed a bridge in Montana that transported her backward through time. As a practical woman who didn't believe in supernatural phenomena, Patricia had always dismissed stories about temporal anomalies as driver fatigue or hallucination. But in October of 2023, Patricia drove across a bridge on Highway 200 that would prove time travel wasn't just theoretical physics. It was something you could experience on certain stretches of road if you crossed at exactly the wrong moment. Patricia was hauling lumber from Missoula to Great Falls, a route that took her through the mountainous terrain of western Montana. The drive was scenic but challenging, with steep grades and winding roads that required constant attention. Patricia had been driving since dawn and was making good time, expecting to reach Great Falls by early evening. Around 3 p.m., Patricia approached a bridge spanning a deep gorge. The bridge was old, steel truss construction from maybe the 1940s, narrow lanes, no shoulder. Patricia had crossed it dozens of times before without incident. But as Patricia drove onto the bridge, something changed. The light shifted, taking on a quality that reminded Patricia of old photographs, slightly sepia-toned, as if the color spectrum had narrowed. The engine sound changed too, the modern diesel growl becoming the rougher sound of an older engine. Patricia glanced at her dashboard and felt her heart skip. The digital displays had vanished. In their place were analog gauges, mechanical speedometer, old-style fuel gauge, none of the modern electronic systems her truck was equipped with. Even the stereo had changed, replaced by an ancient AM radio playing big band music. Patricia looked at her mirrors and saw that her truck had changed. Not her truck anymore, but an older model, 1950s vintage with rounded fenders and a design from decades before her time. And her cargo had changed too. Instead of modern lumber secured with steel straps, Patricia was hauling logs chained down with rope, stacked in a way that wouldn't meet current safety standards. Patricia realized with growing horror what had happened. The bridge had transported her backward through time. She was driving a truck from the past, on a highway from the past, heading toward a destination in a Montana that existed 70 years ago. Patricia's first instinct was to turn around, to go back across the bridge and return to her own time. But the bridge was one way, no turnaround space, and Patricia couldn't reverse with a full load of logs on a narrow bridge. She continued forward, emerging from the bridge into a Montana that looked subtly wrong. The landscape was the same, mountains, forests, rivers, but the details were different. No power lines, no cell towers, no modern infrastructure. The road itself was narrower, unpaved sections alternating with asphalt that looked fresh. Patricia drove for 10 miles, her mind racing, trying to understand what had happened. She'd crossed a bridge and somehow traveled to the past. Every gauge on her dashboard, every detail of her surroundings suggested she was in the 1950s. Then Patricia saw a town ahead, small, maybe 300 people, built around a lumber mill. Patricia pulled off the road and parked, trying to assess her situation. The town looked like a museum exhibit of mid-century America. The cars were 1950s models, the clothing people wore was from that era, the storefronts advertised products and brands that hadn't existed in decades. And Patricia herself had changed. When she looked down at her clothes, she saw she was wearing a style from the 50s, her modern jeans and t-shirt replaced by period-appropriate attire. Patricia walked into the general store, where a clerk looked at her without surprise. "Afternoon, miss. What can I do for you?" "What year is this?" Patricia asked, her voice shaking. The clerk frowned. 1954. "You feeling all right?" Patricia had traveled back 69 years. The bridge had been a passage through time, connecting 2023 to 1954, and Patricia had driven through without realizing what would happen. "I need to find a phone," Patricia said. "I need to call someone." "Phone's over there," the clerk said, pointing to a payphone in the corner. Patricia tried to think of who to call, but realized she didn't know anyone's 1954 phone number. Her family hadn't existed yet. Her parents hadn't been born. Her company didn't exist. Nothing from her time had any presence in 1954. Patricia was stranded in the past with no way to contact her present, no way to prove where she'd come from, no way to explain how she'd arrived. Patricia spent the next 3 days in 1954 Montana, trying to figure out how to return to her own time. She couldn't go back across the bridge. It was a one-way passage, and the time portal only worked in one direction. She was trapped in the past unless she could find another portal, another bridge or road that connected different time periods. Patricia talked to locals, asking subtle questions about unusual roads or bridges, places where strange things happened. One old-timer mentioned a bridge on the other side of Great Falls that people avoided because time didn't work right there. Drivers who crossed it sometimes arrived hours later than they should have, or reported that the landscape looked different on the far side. Patricia drove to Great Falls, which in 1954 was smaller, less developed, and found the bridge the old-timer had described. It looked similar to the bridge she'd crossed to enter the past. Same old steel truss design, same narrow lanes. Patricia said a prayer and drove onto the bridge. The light shifted again, the sepia tone returning. Patricia's truck began to transform, the 1950s gauges dissolving and being replaced by modern digital displays. Her clothing changed back to her jeans and t-shirt. The big band music faded, replaced by the satellite radio she'd been listening to before crossing the first bridge. Patricia emerged from the bridge into 2023. The landscape was right again. Power lines, cell towers, modern infrastructure. Patricia checked her phone. The date showed October 18th, 2023, the same day she'd left her time. Despite spending 3 days in 1954, no time had passed in 2023. Or perhaps time had passed, but the second bridge had returned her to the exact moment she'd departed, closing the loop. Patricia pulled over and sat there, shaking. She'd traveled to the past, lived in 1954 for 3 days, and then returned to her present with no time elapsed. It was impossible, violated every law of causality she understood, but it had happened. Patricia completed her delivery to Great Falls but couldn't stop thinking about the bridges. 2 bridges that connected different time periods, allowing passage backward and forward through decades. And if those bridges existed, how many others were there? How many routes across America had temporal passages built into them, bridges and roads that connected different eras? Patricia tried to find the first bridge again, the one that had taken her to 1954. She drove the same route from Missoula, looked for the steel truss bridge over the gorge, but she couldn't find it. The bridge she remembered didn't exist on any map, wasn't visible from the highway, might not have been there at all in normal chronology. The bridges appeared only at certain times, or to certain people, or under conditions Patricia couldn't identify. They were temporal passages that existed outside the normal timeline, connecting different eras through structures that looked like ordinary bridges but functioned as wormholes through decades. Patricia never found those bridges again. But she heard stories from other drivers about similar experiences, crossing bridges and finding themselves in different time periods, driving roads that led to pasts or futures they shouldn't have been able to access, completing deliveries in eras that didn't match their departure times. The bridge that led to yesterday taught Patricia that time travel isn't just theoretical, that certain structures along America's highways connect different eras through passages that look like ordinary bridges but function as temporal portals, allowing drivers to cross from one time period to another if they drive across at exactly the right moment, entering pasts where their present doesn't exist yet and their future is the world they came from. Living days or weeks in bygone eras before finding return passages that bring them back to their own time with no time elapsed, as if the entire journey happened outside normal chronology, in a bubble where past and present coexisted briefly before diverging again, leaving drivers with memories of walking through towns from decades ago, wearing clothes from different eras, speaking to people who'd been dead for years in the driver's original timeline, experiencing history not as something that happened but as a place you could visit if you knew which bridges to cross and when, and praying you could find a return passage before you were trapped permanently in the wrong era, condemned to live out your life in the past while your present continued without you, aging and dying decades before you were born, creating temporal paradoxes that somehow resolved themselves because the universe allowed bridges to exist that connected different times, that transported trucks and drivers backward and forward through the years, that proved the timeline wasn't as linear as everyone assumed. Just a network of connected moments that bridges could traverse if their construction happened to align with temporal weak points where past and present touched and travelers could cross between them, living lives in multiple eras, crossing bridges that led not just to different places but to different times, to yesterdays and tomorrows that existed simultaneously with today in a geography of time that spans decades rather than miles, where certain bridges are portals and certain drivers are travelers through temporal passages they stumble into without warning, crossing from one era to another and back again, forever changed by knowing that time is a landscape you can drive through if you find the right bridges, the right roads, the right moments when past and present align, and passage becomes possible between the days you came from and the days you briefly inhabited before. The bridge brought you back to where you started, to when you started, closing loops and creating paradoxes that nobody notices because the timeline stitches itself back together and only the drivers who cross the temporal bridges remember what happened, what they saw, what they lived through in eras that weren't their own. Story 6. The radio station that didn't exist. Walter Price had been driving trucks for 17 years when he started receiving transmissions from a radio station that shouldn't have been possible. As someone who spent thousands of hours listening to AM and FM radio during long hauls, Walter knew the broadcast landscape well. Which stations reached which areas, how signals faded with distance, where the dead zones were. But in November of 2023, Walter's radio began picking up a station that didn't appear on any frequency chart, that broadcast content that couldn't have been recorded, that seemed to exist outside normal electromagnetic propagation. Walter was hauling dry goods from Atlanta to Denver, a 3-day run across the South and into the Rockies. He'd been driving since morning and was somewhere in eastern Texas when his radio, tuned to a country music station, suddenly went silent. Not static, not white noise, just complete silence, as if the speakers had been disconnected. Then a voice emerged from the silence. Male, middle-aged, speaking with an accent Walter couldn't place. "You're listening to Station Nowhere, broadcasting from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The time is always now, the location is always here, and the content is what you need to hear, not what you want to hear." Walter reached for the tuning knob, but before he could change the station, the voice continued. "Don't bother trying to find a different frequency, Walter Price. We're not broadcasting on radio waves. We're transmitting directly into your receiver through principles you wouldn't understand. You're going to listen to what we have to say." Walter felt ice in his veins. The station knew his name. How? His radio wasn't connected to any network that could identify him. There was no way a broadcaster could know who was listening. "Your cargo isn't what you think it is," the voice said. "You're hauling dry goods according to your manifest, but hidden among the legitimate items are 72 pounds of methamphetamine. The cargo was loaded in Atlanta by a criminal organization that uses your trucking company as an unwitting courier service. If you continue to Denver and deliver, you'll be arrested at the destination. Police have been tipped off. You're being set up to take the fall." Walter's hands tightened on the wheel. This had to be a prank, or a scam, or some kind of psychological operation. But the specificity of the information, his name, his route, the exact weight of drugs supposedly hidden in his cargo, suggested something more serious. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Walter said aloud, unsure if the station could hear him. "You don't," the voice replied, somehow receiving Walter's question. "But you can verify it. Stop and inspect your cargo. You'll find the drugs hidden inside boxes labeled as machine parts. 72 pounds packed in vacuum-sealed bags. They're counting on you to deliver it without inspection." Walter pulled off at the next exit and parked at a truck stop. He broke the trailer seal, something he wasn't supposed to do, and opened the doors to inspect his cargo. The trailer was packed with pallets of dry goods, food products, paper goods, cleaning supplies, standard items that matched his manifest. But Walter started opening boxes, digging through the cargo, looking for anything that didn't belong. In boxes labeled industrial machine parts, Walter found them. Vacuum-sealed bags of white crystalline powder, packed among legitimate machine components. Exactly as the radio station had described, 72 pounds of methamphetamine hidden in his trailer. Walter sat on the trailer's edge, his mind reeling. The radio station had been telling the truth. He was hauling drugs without knowing it, being used as an unwitting courier by criminals who'd infiltrated his company's supply chain. Walter called the police and reported the drugs. He was detained for questioning, his cargo was seized, and an investigation was launched into his company's operations. Walter was eventually cleared of wrongdoing. He genuinely hadn't known about the drugs, but his truck was impounded as evidence, and Walter was suspended pending the investigation's conclusion. Walter never forgot the radio station that had saved him from arrest and prison. He tried to find it again, scanning through every frequency, but station nowhere never appeared. It had broadcast once, warned him, and then vanished. Over the following months, Walter heard similar stories from other drivers. They'd been warned by mysterious radio broadcasts about cargo issues, about routes that would lead to accidents, about mechanical problems before they became critical. Always the same format, a voice that knew their name, that provided specific information, that couldn't be traced to any legitimate broadcaster. Some drivers called it the ghost station. Others called it the guardian voice. A few claimed it was an AI system or a government black operation or aliens monitoring truck drivers for unknown purposes. Walter researched the phenomenon and found scattered reports going back decades. Drivers receiving warnings over their radios from sources that shouldn't exist, broadcasts that saved lives or prevented disasters, voices that knew things they couldn't know through normal means. Walter concluded that Station Nowhere was real but existed outside normal electromagnetic propagation. It wasn't broadcasting on radio frequencies, but rather transmitting directly into receivers through some mechanism that bypassed conventional physics. Maybe quantum entanglement, or directed energy, or something else entirely. The station appeared to specific drivers at critical moments when they needed warnings about dangers they couldn't detect themselves. It monitored truckers somehow, knew details about their cargo and routes, and intervened when necessary to prevent catastrophes or arrests or deaths. Walter never heard from Station Nowhere again, but he remained grateful for that one broadcast, for the voice that had warned him about the drugs hidden in his cargo, for the station that existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, and had chosen to save him from a fate he'd been heading toward unknowingly. The radio station that didn't exist taught Walter that some broadcasts originate from sources beyond conventional transmitters, that warnings can arrive through receivers from origins that can't be mapped or explained, and that drivers traveling America's highways are sometimes monitored by intelligences that track their cargo and routes and intervene when necessary, transmitting warnings through radios that shouldn't be able to receive the signals, speaking with voices that know your name and your situation and your immediate future, offering information that could save your life or freedom or career if you're willing to listen to broadcasts from stations that exist nowhere on the dial but everywhere in the quantum foam that underlies reality. Stations that appear when needed and vanish when their warnings have been delivered, leaving drivers grateful but confused, saved but uncertain whether what they heard was real or hallucination, whether Station Nowhere actually exists or whether it's just a name drivers give to the voice in their heads that sometimes warns them about dangers they can't see, the intuition that manifests as radio broadcasts because that's the form that makes sense to people who spend thousands of hours listening to AM and FM, who trust their radios more than their instincts, who need warnings to come from external sources rather than acknowledging that sometimes you just know things without understanding how, that sometimes information arrives through channels that aren't quantifiable, that Station Nowhere might just be the part of your mind that processes patterns faster than consciousness, and presents conclusions as if they came from outside rather than admitting they emerged from your own subconscious assessment of subtle cues and probabilities. Warning you about drugs you didn't consciously know were there but had noticed some inconsistency about, some wrongness in how the cargo was loaded or sealed or manifested. Details your conscious mind dismissed but your pattern recognition systems flagged as dangerous. Broadcasting warnings through the metaphor of a radio station because that's how your brain chose to present information that could save you if you listened. Story 7. The Convoy That Never Ended. Ernest Shaw had been driving trucks for 30 years when he joined a convoy that stretched beyond the horizon and never stopped moving. As a veteran of countless cross-country hauls, Ernest was familiar with informal convoys, groups of trucks traveling together for company and mutual assistance. But in December of 2023, Ernest merged onto Interstate 80 in Nebraska and found himself in a convoy so vast it seemed to have no beginning or end. Trucks extending in both directions as far as he could see, all maintaining perfect spacing and speed, all heading east with grim determination toward a destination that might not exist. Ernest had left California 3 days earlier, hauling furniture to New York. The route across Nebraska was flat, straight, mind-numbingly boring. To break the monotony, Ernest tried to find another truck to pace with, someone to exchange CB chatter with during the long crossing. Around noon, Ernest saw a convoy ahead, dozens of trucks, maybe hundreds, stretched across all lanes of the interstate. Ernest accelerated to catch up, intending to join their formation. As Ernest merged into the convoy, he noticed something odd. Every truck was traveling at exactly 65 miles per hour. Not approximately 65, exactly 65, as if their cruise controls were synchronized to a central system. And the spacing between trucks was identical, each vehicle maintaining a precise following distance. Ernest grabbed his CB. "Breaker, breaker, this is Road Sage joining your convoy. Anyone got their ears on?" Silence. Ernest tried different channels, called out multiple times. No response. The convoy was running silent, no radio chatter, no communication between drivers. Ernest looked at the trucks around him. They were all older models, 1980s and 90s vintage, nothing modern. The trailers were unmarked, no company logos or identifying information. And most disturbing, Ernest couldn't see drivers in the cabs. The windows were too tinted or the angles were wrong, but no human forms were visible behind the steering wheels. Ernest tried to slow down, to let the convoy pass him by. But when he reduced his speed, the trucks behind him slowed to match. He couldn't break free of the formation. The convoy had absorbed him, integrated him into its pattern. Ernest tried to accelerate, to pull ahead, but the trucks in front matched his speed increase, maintaining the same relative spacing. Ernest was trapped in the convoy, unable to go faster or slower, forced to maintain the exact formation. Hours passed. The convoy continued east across Nebraska, never varying speed, never stopping. Ernest's fuel gauge dropped steadily. Eventually, he'd need to refuel, but the convoy showed no signs of exiting for gas stations. Ernest tried to force his way out by cutting across lanes toward the shoulder. But the trucks around him adjusted, blocking his path, herding him back into formation. The convoy wouldn't release him. As darkness fell, Ernest noticed the truck's headlights creating a river of light that extended to the horizon. Behind him, the convoy stretched equally far. Ernest was in the middle of a formation that seemed infinite, trucks extending in both directions forever. Ernest's CB crackled to life. A voice emerged, flat, emotionless, speaking in monotone. Maintain formation, maintain speed, destination approaching. Do not deviate. What destination? Ernest asked. Where is this convoy going? Destination approaching. Maintain formation. I need to refuel. I'm going to run out of gas. Fuel unnecessary. Maintain formation. Ernest looked at his fuel gauge. It showed a quarter tank remaining, maybe 100 miles of range. But the convoy showed no signs of stopping. What happened when trucks ran out of fuel? Did they just coast to a stop while the convoy continued around them? Ernest watched his gauge drop over the next hour. 20%, 15, 10. He was going to run dry soon, and then he'd find out what happened to trucks that couldn't maintain the formation. But when Ernest's gauge reached 5%, when he should have had maybe 30 miles remaining, something impossible happened. The gauge stopped dropping. It stayed at 5% mile after mile, as if his fuel was no longer being consumed. His engine continued running, his truck maintained speed, but no diesel was burning. The convoy was sustaining its vehicles through some mechanism that didn't rely on fuel. The trucks ran on something else, momentum or collective will, or energy drawn from the formation itself. Ernest tried the door handles. Locked. He couldn't exit his cab even if he wanted to. The convoy had him trapped inside his own truck, forcing him to drive east toward a destination he didn't choose, toward a purpose he didn't understand. Days passed. Ernest lost track of time. The convoy never stopped, never slowed. They crossed Nebraska, entered Iowa, continued through Illinois. Ernest's biological needs, hunger, thirst, sleep, seemed suspended. He didn't feel tired, didn't need to eat or drink, just drove mechanically as part of the endless formation. Other trucks occasionally tried to join the convoy from entrance ramps. The formation absorbed them, integrated them into the pattern, adding to the infinite river of vehicles heading east. Ernest tried to count the trucks ahead of him to estimate the convoy's size, but the count became meaningless. Hundreds? Thousands? Millions? The formation extended beyond the horizon in both directions, so vast that individual vehicles lost significance. Ernest realized with horror what he'd joined. This wasn't a normal convoy. This was a mass migration, an exodus of trucks traveling east toward some destination that drew them with magnetic inevitability. The trucks were being called, summoned, pulled towards something in the east that Ernest couldn't identify but could feel. A presence, a gravity well, a terminus where all convoys eventually arrived. As the formation entered Indiana, Ernest saw trucks that looked ancient, models from the 1940s and 50s, vehicles that should have been in museums, somehow still running, still maintaining formation. The convoy had been gathering trucks for decades, absorbing vehicles from every era, creating a temporal procession that spanned generations. Ernest tried one last time to escape. He cut his wheel hard right, crashed through the formation, bounced off other trucks, forced his way toward the shoulder. The convoy's trucks adjusted, tried to herd him back, but Ernest kept fighting, kept pushing toward the edge. Finally, after what felt like hours of collision and grinding metal, Ernest's truck broke free. He careened onto the shoulder, then off the highway entirely, crashing through a guardrail and down an embankment. His truck rolled twice before coming to rest in a field. Ernest climbed out, bruised but alive. He watched the convoy continue east on the highway above, an endless river of trucks that flowed past without stopping, without acknowledging the one vehicle that had escaped. Ernest walked to the nearest town and called his company. His truck was totaled, his cargo scattered across a field. But Ernest was alive, had escaped the convoy that never ended. Ernest never learned where the convoy was heading. Some drivers who'd encountered it speculated the formation was traveling to the Atlantic coast, where trucks would drive into the ocean and disappear beneath the waves. Others thought the convoy was heading toward a dimensional portal in the eastern states, a gateway where vehicles could cross into other realities. Ernest didn't know and didn't want to know. He'd escaped, and that was enough. He retired from trucking immediately, unwilling to risk encountering the convoy again. But Ernest heard reports of other drivers who'd seen the formation. It continued to cross the Midwest, heading east, absorbing trucks that got too close, growing larger with each passing year. A migration that never ended, a convoy that stretched beyond horizons, trucks from every era traveling together toward a destination that might be the ocean, or might be something stranger, something that called to vehicles and pulled them inexorably eastward, adding them to a formation that had been growing for decades, that would continue growing until every truck on America's highways had been absorbed into the endless convoy, the infinite procession, the river of vehicles flowing toward whatever terminus waited in the east. The destination that called to trucks and drivers alike, pulling them into formation and holding them there, suspended in eternal transit, forever traveling but never arriving, maintained by forces that didn't rely on fuel or physics. Just the collective momentum of thousands of vehicles moving as one, heading east toward the place where all journeys end, where all convoys converge, where trucks go to become part of something larger than themselves, absorbed into the formation that never stops, never varies speed, never releases those who join it, just continues forever eastward across the American landscape, a migration without end, a convoy that grows with every vehicle it captures, heading toward a destination that might be real or might just be the horizon itself, forever receding, forever calling, forever pulling the convoy forward into an eternity of synchronized driving toward the place all trucks eventually go, the terminus they can't resist, the destination that waits in the east and draws everything toward it with patient, relentless gravity. Story 8. The Final Delivery. Richard Alvarez had been driving trucks for 35 years when he accepted the delivery that would be his last. Not because he retired or died, but because he delivered cargo to a destination that didn't exist and couldn't leave. As a veteran driver planning to retire within months, Richard took one final cross-country haul in January of 2023. Transporting sealed crates from Maine to an address in Oregon that was listed on the manifest but didn't appear on any map. Richard assumed it was a clerical error, a rural location that hadn't been added to GPS databases yet. But the address was real, and the delivery would transport Richard beyond the boundaries of normal geography into a place where trucks arrived but never departed. Richard picked up the cargo in Portland, Maine, 6 large crates loaded onto pallets, sealed with industrial strapping and marked with biohazard symbols. The paperwork listed the contents as medical research materials and provided an Oregon delivery address. 4709 Cascade Falls Road, coordinates that placed the location somewhere in the mountains east of Salem. Richard secured the load and began his cross-country drive. The route took him through Canada briefly, then across the northern states, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, and finally Oregon. A week-long journey, Richard's last haul before retirement. The drive was uneventful until Richard reached Oregon and tried to locate the delivery address. His GPS couldn't find Cascade Falls Road. Richard tried online maps, asked locals, checked with his dispatcher. No one had heard of that road, and no mapping service showed it existing, but the coordinates were specific. Richard drove to the approximate area and found himself on a logging road that wound deep into the Cascade Mountains. The road wasn't on any map, wasn't marked with signs, just existed as a barely maintained track through dense forest. Richard followed the road for over an hour, climbing higher into the mountains, wondering if he'd made a wrong turn. Then he saw a sign. Cascade Falls Road, private property, no trespassing. Richard continued, his truck bouncing over rough surface, until he reached a cleared area with several buildings that looked like a research facility. Barracks-style structures, laboratories, security fencing. A guard station blocked the road, and armed personnel approached Richard's truck. "Delivery for Cascade Falls Research Station," Richard said, showing his paperwork. The guard checked a list and nodded. "You're expected. Follow the access road to loading dock C." Richard drove into the facility, following signs to the designated dock. The place looked official but strangely isolated. No power lines, no visible communication equipment, no indication of how the facility connected to the outside world. At the loading dock, technicians in hazmat suits unloaded Richard's cargo. They worked quickly and efficiently, speaking little, moving the crates into the main building. Richard watched, feeling increasingly uneasy. Something about this place felt wrong. The isolation, the secrecy, the way the technicians avoided eye contact. After the cargo was unloaded, Richard signed the delivery confirmation and prepared to leave. But when he tried to drive back toward the guard station, the access road had changed. Instead of leading back the way he'd come, the road now forked in multiple directions, none of them familiar. Richard stopped and checked his GPS. No signal. His phone showed no service. His CB radio produced only static. He was cut off from outside communication. Richard chose a road at random and followed it. The road twisted through the forest, climbed higher into the mountains, eventually terminated at a cliff edge with no turnaround space. Richard had to back up for over a mile to find a spot wide enough to reverse direction. He tried a different road. This one led to another research building, identical to the one where he'd delivered cargo. But the building was abandoned, windows broken, equipment rusting. It looked like it had been deserted for decades, though Richard had just seen an operational facility minutes ago. Richard tried a third road. This one led back to the guard station, but the guards were different people, and they looked at Richard with confusion when he explained he'd just made a delivery. "No deliveries were scheduled today," the guard said, "and our facility has been closed for 3 years. We're just security maintaining the property until it's decommissioned." "I just delivered cargo an hour ago," Richard insisted. 6 crates of medical research materials. You can check your logs." The guard checked a computer terminal and shook his head. "No record of any delivery, and loading dock C was demolished 2 years ago. Are you feeling all right, sir?" Richard felt reality fracturing. He'd delivered cargo to a facility that was now closed. He'd seen technicians that didn't exist according to the guards. He'd driven roads that led to contradictory destinations. Richard tried to leave, to find his way back to the main highway. But every road he took led somewhere different, to abandoned buildings, to cliffs, to dead ends, to versions of the facility in different states of operation or decay. He was trapped in a loop of contradictory geographies, unable to find an exit. Days passed. Richard rationed his food and water, sleeping in his truck, driving endlessly through a landscape that shifted and changed. He encountered other drivers, men and women who'd delivered cargo to the facility and couldn't leave, who'd been trapped for weeks or months or years, who survived by scavenging supplies from the various versions of the research station that appeared along the shifting roads. "This place is unstable," one driver told Richard. "The facility exists in multiple timelines simultaneously. When you deliver cargo here, you get caught in the overlap, the space between different versions of reality. The roads connect different timelines, and you can't find your way back to your original timeline because it's one of infinite possibilities." "There has to be a way out," Richard said. "Maybe. Some drivers claim they've escaped, but most of us are here permanently. We're ghosts, trapped between timelines, delivering cargo to a facility that exists in every timeline but is abandoned in most, operational in a few, under construction in others. We cycle through all the versions, encountering different configurations of the same location, never able to leave." Richard refused to accept permanent imprisonment. He studied the pattern of roads, looking for consistency. He found that certain routes appeared more stable, led to similar destinations regardless of when he traveled them. These stable routes might be connections to the primary timeline, paths that could lead back to normal reality. Richard followed the most stable route he'd identified, driving with determination despite dead ends and wrong turns. He drove for what felt like weeks, though time measurement became meaningless in this place where different timelines overlapped. Finally, Richard emerged onto a paved highway that looked familiar. He recognized landmarks, saw mile markers that matched his maps. He'd escaped the facility, returned to his timeline, or at least to a timeline that resembled it enough to function as home. Richard drove straight to the nearest town and reported the facility's location to authorities. But when police investigated, they found nothing. No research station, no buildings, no evidence that any facility had ever existed at those coordinates. Just forest and mountains, wilderness that hadn't been disturbed. Richard's company had no record of the delivery he'd made. The cargo he'd supposedly hauled from Maine didn't exist in their systems. The paperwork Richard carried was dismissed as forgery or hallucination. Richard was evaluated for psychological breakdown, stress-induced delusion. The doctors found no evidence of mental illness, just a veteran driver telling a story that couldn't be corroborated, describing a delivery to a location that didn't exist. Richard retired immediately after the evaluation. He'd made his final delivery, completed his last haul, and escaped from a place where other drivers remained trapped. Cycling through timelines, delivering cargo to facilities that existed in some realities and not in others. Unable to return to their original lives because they'd crossed into overlapping spaces where multiple versions of reality intersected. The final delivery taught Richard that some destinations exist in quantum superposition, operational in some timelines and abandoned in others. Receiving cargo from drivers who get trapped in the overlap and can't find their way back to singular reality. Condemned to drive forever through shifting landscapes where the same facility appears in different states of existence depending on which road you take, which timeline you're accessing, which version of the research station manifests when you arrive, and whether you can find the stable routes that lead back home, or whether you're permanently lost in the maze of contradictory geographies that exist in places where multiple timelines touch, where destinations exist and don't exist simultaneously, where deliveries are made to facilities that are closed or operational or under construction depending on which moment in time you're accessing, and where drivers who make the mistake of accepting loads to these addresses find themselves trapped between realities, making their final delivery again and again to destinations that shift and change with each approach, never able to complete the run and return home, just cycling endlessly through timelines where their cargo is received or rejected, where facilities operate or stand abandoned, where the same roads lead to different places depending on when you travel them, trapped in superposition, unable to collapse back into singular existence, forever making deliveries to destinations that exist everywhere and nowhere, accepting cargo receipts from technicians who might be real or might be echoes from other timelines, signing paperwork that exists in some realities and not in others, and driving away on roads that branch into infinite possibilities, all of them wrong, none of them leading home, just cycling through variations of the same impossible delivery forever.